dating apps are having a rocky moment. One, Match Group, has struggled to maintain paying subscribers for its most popular app, Tinder, and in July announced plans to cut 6% of its global workforce. This came a few months after rival app Bumble said it would lay off 30% of its workforce after disappointing results. Since online dating first emerged in the mid-1990s, apps have revolutionised the search for love. But now it seems that Generation Z might prefer to meet cute in real life. In this episode, we hear from researchers exploring how apps have changed modern dating and why some users aren't actually there looking for love at all, but keep on swiping anyway. I'm Gemma Ware, and this is The Conversation Weekly, the world explained by experts. I'm joined today by my colleague Nehal El-Hadi, the interim editor-in-chief at The Conversation in Canada, who some of you may remember used to host the show about a year or so ago. Great to have you back on, Nehal.
Thanks for having me back.
Well, we missed you. So, Nehal, we're talking today about dating apps and the way they're influencing the behaviour of the people who use them. This is based on a story that you worked on a little while back. But what got you thinking about this topic?
I was interested in the ways masculinity and what it meant to be a man was changing, mainly through social media, the internet. So I commissioned an article from Trina Orchard, who's an associate professor in the School of Health Studies at Western University in London, Canada. And Trina's book, Sticky, Sexy, Sad, looked at her experiences in online dating.
And she does this particular type of research called self-ethnography. Some people might not really know what that is. So how would you describe it?
So Trina is trained as an anthropologist, and ethnography is a research methodology that examines how a specific culture engages in their particular customs and practices. Self-ethnography centers the researcher with it and locates them within that culture. And so what Trina was doing was using her own personal experiences with online dating and dating apps, and then using her critical skills as a researcher to analyze and explore what she was experiencing in real life.
And she had some fascinating findings, so we're going to hear about them. But thanks, Nehal, for coming on and introducing her.
Thank you for having me.
I started using dating apps in late August of 2017. I had been single for over a year by my choice and had done a lot of personal healing. I had been sober for about 3 or 4 years by that point and was ready to get back out in the romance situation, environment, and that's why I began using dating apps.
At 45, Trina found herself in a position where few of her friends had tried dating apps.
I am such an old-fashioned Stone Age person, and it was quite terrifying thinking about doing dating in a totally different way than I had for the majority of my life. So it took a lot of courage to make that decision to even download an app.
Over the course of her dating life journey, Trina had to learn to adapt to the social codes that people use to communicate with on dating apps.
And people were advising me to develop a thick skin because it's just a game and people are terrible and don't take it too seriously. But I wanted to connect, and so I was taking it seriously.
Trina's day job as an anthropologist quickly proved useful. Rather than simply participating in online interactions, she started to see them as a valuable opportunity to study online dating culture.
I'm trained to look for patterns as a scholar, and I just found it so bewildering and fascinating that it quickly became a situation where it was, yes, I was on these apps to meet people, but I was also very fascinated by them as a culture in the palm of my hand. And so I began to look at it also as a kind of project. And that helped me survive it, frankly, because I stayed in the game longer than I probably should have, because I was really dedicated to understanding as much of this cultural environment as I could.
Her experiences eventually led her to publish her book, where she shares and analyses her interactions and sheds light on online dating culture more broadly. So you recently wrote a book called Sticky, Sexy, Sad, Swipe Culture, The Darker Side of Dating Apps. What do you mean in that darker side of dating apps phrase that you've used in your title?
The darker side of dating apps refers to the widespread misogyny that stream through these platforms and the people who use them. It refers to the way that the algorithm really shapes users' experiences, and it's quite addictive using these things, swiping, and the way that users are rewarded for being extra productive on dating apps and also punished when we're not, because you're getting people you've already said no to as opposed to all the fresh kind of new matches in the area. And in terms of the darker side of dating apps, the profound amount of labor, emotional, technical, that is required to find success on dating apps. At least that certainly was my experience. Yeah, it was bewildering because they're a microcosm of our society. You know, they're not a totally different enclave or this little distinctive bubble that's just fun and games and love. Quite the opposite.
Some of these experiences left lasting impressions, both for better and for worse.
A couple of the men I met, they morphed into really significant relationships. I didn't fall madly, deeply in love with all of them, but there were shades of love. And that was really important to my evolution as a woman who was coming into herself as a sober person who was also finding different kinds of success in my intimate life.
To protect the identities of the different men she's dated as part of her autoethnographic research, Trina uses colours to refer to them throughout the book.
The book is full of different vignettes, 13 different men who I feature as a way to trace the evolution that I went through in my dating app experience, from the first time I got ghosted to what dating was like during the pandemic.
Tell me about that first time you got ghosted.
Well, it was mortifying, wasn't it? Right? Being ghosted is terrible. In the vignette, I trace the first hot kind of interactions that I had with this individual and how I was very excited and hopeful. Also a little bit of trepidation, but I wanted to go for it and I wanted to meet this individual, and then he vanished. And I have no idea why. But in this instance, I was able to gather a little bit of additional information because he then matched with me 3 more times in the course of a month. And I kept matching with him because I wanted to meet him. It was the only way that I could connect with him to try and ask him, why are you doing this? And I mean, the answer was woefully unsatisfactory. It was just like, oh, I'm still in something with my ex. And it's like, yeah, but why are you connecting with me then? That has nothing to do with me in a way. I didn't get any kind of good answer. And then they just disappear and you have no recourse. You can't even text them or ask them why because they don't exist anymore. And a lot of people laugh about ghosting. Oh, yeah, it's just, part of the game. And it's true, it is part of the game, but it feels terrible. And so that vignette is funny, and it's also really embarrassing because when it happened, I emailed Bumble customer service because I didn't know that I had been ghosted. And people laugh whenever I read this one, but then they remember the first time it happened to them too.
I wondered, these conversations you've had with your students and people who are coming at this kind of from a younger generation, do you think that they also react in the same way to those experiences?
I think that to a certain degree it's normalized, but that's one of the reasons why I wanted to write the book, was to shake people out of the passive acceptance of these things, because none of them are normal. They may have become normalized or seen as something to be expected, but they're not really normal. It's not normal to talk to 100 or 200 people a day or swipe on 200 people a day. Like, we would never do that in the flesh. Yes, it's common, but I don't think we've adjusted all that well to it. And the moment I would share some of my experiences, even though students have been experiencing these things probably for longer than I have, they feel the same way. There is kind of an acceptance of it, but there's also like, yeah, no, it does feel terrible. And you're absolutely right. And yeah, that happened to me too.
Where did you end your kind of journey on these dating apps?
The end point was someone who I fell in love with. And the last vignette is quite an erotic poem, frankly. And it's a little different than the other ones. And it should be, because that man and those feelings were different.
Well, thank you so much, Trina. Really appreciate your time today.
My pleasure.
Trina's experiences offer a window into the struggles of using dating apps and the simple amount of work involved. She came across people using apps for a whole range of reasons, some eager to meet the right person straight away, others more interested in just having endless conversations without ever intending to meet face to face. So what are dating apps doing to people's expectations for love and relationships? Carolina Bandinelli is a sociologist at the University of Warwick in the UK. Her work focuses on the contemporary cultures surrounding love, dating and sex, and she's also spent time interviewing people about their behaviour on dating apps.
I think every society and culture at every moment in time, we have developed new technologies to deal with dating. This messy activity of finding some kind of partner, whether for one night or for one's life. And dating apps are the digital technologies of these.
Carolina recently published a book called The Post-Romantic. As part of her research, she conducted over 50 formal interviews with dating app users and chatted to more than 100 more to find out how and why they use apps.
These were mostly aged from 20 to 40 and based in the UK and in Italy, both from large cities such as London, Milan and Naples, and smaller places like Coventry in the UK and like peripheral areas of Italy. There were people from different sexual orientations and ethnic backgrounds. However, I would say most of them were from a middle-class background and had access to a good education.
So these were all people who've had some experience of dating apps. What were you hoping to hear from them when you set out having these conversations with them?
If I have to be really honest with you, I was hoping to hear some sort of adventurous, spicy tales. I kind of wanted to have fun, in a sense, right? I think I was imbued with a common sense that dating apps have made sex easier, have made easier to meet people. And also I was thinking, oh, well, if I had dating apps in my 20s, I would have done this and that. So these were my expectations when I started.
She found something entirely different.
Most of the people I've talked to weren't even meeting anybody by means of dating app, let alone having sex or having a relationship with them. So most of the people were using dating apps for purposes different than the actual dating, like meeting another human in flesh and bones somewhere and drink a beer. That was within the realm of things that people would consider to happen, but it was not the main or most significant part of it all. So that my argument eventually became, and I'm phrasing it in a bit of a provocative way, that dating apps are technologies not to meet anybody.
What were people doing on them if they're not trying to find someone to meet?
Well, the first thing that you can do with the dating apps without the need of meeting anybody in real life is to get matches. A match, as I understood, at my own expenses, because at one point I also downloaded Tinder and I expected to receive many invitations for going out. And in fact, I didn't at all. And at one point I was having dinner with a friend and also a key participant in my ethnographic research on the topic. And I was telling him, why do people match with me, but they don't ask me out? I don't understand. And he told me, you think as if you were offline, but you need to think within the online logic. And eventually I understood that a match is not a prelude to an encounter, is not what happens before the actual day. A match is reassuring who receives it, saying you are likable, you are desirable, you might have these many romantic encounters. People accumulate matches.
Okay, so it's a status symbol. You know, I've got X number of matches.
There is what you're saying, playing the game of reputation. Like I have these matches, there's a gamified logic at stake. The more matches I have, the cooler I am. And this is a remediation of the hookup culture, in which the more people you would attract, the higher your sexual capital.
Karolina says that relatively few people she interviewed actually mentioned using their matches as status symbols or to brag. Instead, she found that matches served many other functions.
Matches are used by people after a breakup to get some sort of solace, or to be able to at least imagine that there could be other opportunities. And then there are other people that are in a long-term relationship and they feel that kind of exhaustion that may very well happen in long-term relationships. And they would use dating apps to see if they are attractive, or as a way to test some of our own desires. For instance, a young woman that I've interviewed, and she was based at the time of the interview in a little town close to Naples, would use dating apps to match with other women because it was for her very difficult to meet other women interested in women in her own surroundings.
Perhaps the most startling cases were of people who intentionally matched with others who weren't at all close by. One example Karolina gives is of a young woman from the north of England who would change her phone's location to places far away from where she was living.
Because she said, I could never bear the possibility of actually meeting somebody I met. So she used the geolocalization to avoid the possibility of meeting somebody in real life. And for her, she was quite young, about 19, using Tinder was a way to test her femininity and to test her seduction potentialities, but she would have felt very embarrassed to meet a stranger. The other person, a heterosexual man in his late 30s, he would use dating apps, specifically Tinder, to match with people in other countries. It was a sort of disembodied dating tourism. And it was also a way for him to get a sense of a country that he might want to visit in the future. Another person, another man based in Naples, he told me that he would use the app just to hack and tease the algorithm. So he was very aware that his relationship was one with the algorithm. And also he wanted to feel reassured that he could, in fact, seduce women. Then there are also people that use dating app to meet other people. This queer Indian American student based in England, they told me that they would use dating apps such as Hinge and Field to meet people and to have sex with people. They had a very rational approach. So they would use different apps to match with as many people as possible, and they were keeping track of it with an Excel document. Perhaps I must say that they were PhD in mathematics. There was also this enjoyment, and their objective was to have at least 2 dates each week.
Very functional.
Very functional. So it's varied, isn't it?
I asked Karolina if she thought that people who weren't genuinely interested in meeting others might have developed these patterns of behaviour during the COVID-19 pandemic, when in-person meetings were not possible.
I think that it started before. I think that especially Gen Z and millennials, there is some sort of exhaustion when it comes to the perspective of dating and meeting people and getting to know people and eventually having a relationship. I think that after decades in which having a vibrant dating life has become a social expectation, people have grown suspicious of it, tired of it, fed up. Hence, dating apps are a handy tool to sort of obey this imperative and pretend you are out there in the scene of dating without actually being there with the body, without exposing oneself at the many potential delusions. I'm not saying that people don't date other people, that people don't have sex, fall in love, get married, or my former flatmate met someone on Tinder. They have 3 babies now. I went to their wedding. But this is pretty obvious. I mean, this has been going on for quite a long time. I think it is more interesting to look at this non-obvious use of dating apps. But then, if you think about it twice, you realize that, in fact, it is quite obvious, because the business model of a dating app requires it not to work that well. Because if you found what you're promised, then you wouldn't need the app anymore.
In her work, Carolina argues that the slogans and strategies promoted by these apps have injected new expectations about how dating should unfold.
I think that an ideology around efficiency is one of the key traits of the digital culture of love. First of all, it is at the core of dating apps' promotional narrative. So if you think about Tinder's slogan, match, chat, date, it promises to reduce the messiness and the mysteriousness, the uncertainty of the encounter of a 3-steps procedure. And overall, digital technologies in general, they reproduce this logic of efficiency. They promise a solution, is what Morozov calls solutionism. So in a way, dating apps promise to find a digital fix for love, to make things easier, in particular, to maximize the possibilities, to widen the range of choices. Love is good when it's efficient.
I wonder how this efficiency of how the apps and the algorithms work and the language around them, how you think that's actually changing the way people think about love and dating itself and romanticism.
A new ethos is emerging, a new paradigm is emerging when it comes to love, and that there is a new way in which we are thinking about love, a new utopia attached to it. And it is what I call the post-romantic utopia. And one of the traits of the post-romantic utopia is that of an ideal of love that has to work efficiently and ideally in a way that does not hurt. So post-romantic love is a kind of love devoid of the risk, the potential of trauma, the potential for pain and suffering.
And by hurt, you mean also the effort, right? The labor that goes into doing it.
The specific labor that the post-romantic subject engages with is the labor of vetting, is the labor of examining the situation, examining a potential partner before going out with them. So, for instance, at some point there was quite a major trend amongst dating apps users, especially women, that would send a questionnaire to potential dates. And then they would assess whether it would make sense to meet or not.
For Carolina, this post-romantic shift is reflected in the language people frequently use to talk about love, sex, and dating.
Think about how pervasive is the language about red flags in digital cultures. The moment you see a red flag is not for you to understand, it's not for you to question the situation, it's not for you to know more. It is something that tells you this is not for you. And I'm not saying red flags are wrong necessarily and that people have to throw themselves into whatever kind of relationship or toxic relationships. But what I'm trying to say is that the specific work of lovers in the post-romantic era is to try to spot before potential risks.
She says people used to speak more in the language of romantic love.
the language of romantic love was mostly the language of literature and poetry or pop songs and romantic comedies. So a language based on emphasis with the lyric quality of many different authors from Shakespeare to Lady Gaga.
Now she's noticing a kind of post-romantic vocabulary derived from the language of clinical psychology or therapy speech.
And again, it is a diagnostic language. It's a language that talks of the potential pathologies of love. A love that can be toxic, love that can be abusive, love that can be oppressive, people that could be gaslighting, people that could be mansplaining. It is a language that talks about boundaries a lot. So it is no more the romantic vocabulary of literature and poetry. It is the vocabulary of clinical psychology, and it has no more the function of glorifying love as such, but it has the function of identifying the corrupted areas of love and potentially cure them.
She's in no way suggesting that dating app users should overlook abusive behaviour.
I really would like not to come across as a nostalgic, meaning that I'm not saying that the good old times in which we could have toxic relationships and call them love. I very often think about how I would have dealt with some experiences of mine had I had, when I was younger, had I had the tools that are available at a mainstream level now. If I think about, yes, some encounters of mine, there were definitely people that were love bombing me. And had I known the word, perhaps I wouldn't have thought.
You would have used it.
Yeah, I would have used it, and perhaps it would have helped me, saving me perhaps sometimes. But also, on the other hand, I wrote some, maybe bad or maybe good, but I wrote some poetry because of these encounters.
Karolina believes people should think more critically about which elements of loving somebody are inevitably painful or difficult, and what parts shouldn't be tolerated.
I suppose that the question that my book asks, and the question that I think is entailing the post-romantic ethos, is where do we draw the line between that existential suffering, which is part of being human, and which means facing the fragility, the vulnerability of our existence. And love has a lot to do with this vulnerability, because the moment you love someone, you can lose them.
Thank you so much, Karolina, for coming on and sharing your insights with us on the podcast.
Thank you, Gemma. It was nice to meet you.
That's it for this week's episode. Thank you to Nahal El-Hadi, who we heard from at the top of the show, and to both the researchers we spoke to for this episode. We'll put a link in our show notes to an article that Trina Orchard wrote about her new research on the conversation. This episode was written and produced by Mend Marawani with assistance from Katie Flood. Sound design was by Michelle Macklem, and our theme music is by Nita Saal. Stephen Kahn is our global executive editor, and I am Gemma Ware, the show's host and executive producer. You can connect with us on Instagram at theconversation.com or email us directly at podcast@theconversation.com. You can also sign up for The Conversation's free daily newsletter by going to the link in our show notes. If you like what we do and want to support the podcast and The Conversation and its project more broadly, please go to donate.theconversation.com. That's donate.theconversation.com. And please also rate and review the show wherever you listen. If you listen to us on the app Pocket Casts, they've just launched the ability to rate and review shows. So please do go on there and give us a rating and a review. It really helps. Thanks very much for listening.